bleed build is a term that strikes fear into the hearts of many an Elden Ring gamer, only because of Elden Ring, but Dark Souls actually did it first. So, which Souls game has the best bleed build, and did it by chance inspire Elden Rings? Let's go chronologically, starting with Dark Souls 1. So let's start out with the Thief class because it has a bandit knife that does extra crit damage and starts off with bleed inherently. So when you go through the Asylum, you'll notice that many enemies do take bleed, including the Asylum Demon, but the damage itself is relatively low, being a knife. Now when you finally get out into the world of Dark Souls, you'll notice that any weapon you pick up that has bleed on it, well, doesn't seem to be causing much bleed, and the reason for that is simple. The weapons are usually too powerful to make bleed happen in the first place. Proccing bleed is nearly impossible in Dark Souls 1, it's freaking ridiculous. So you know the Reinforced Club, that really popular challenge runner weapon that you can obtain very early on? Yeah, it has bleed on it. Did you know it had bleed on it? Well, even if you did, you've never seen it actually cause bleed on anything because it's more powerful than the bleed proccing ability itself. In fact, pretty much any bleed weapon in Dark Souls 1 just doesn't do it. It's just better off as its own weapon by itself without even considering bleed as an option. Now with that in mind, there is one weapon in Dark Souls 1 that does cause bleed relatively consistently. Your bandit knife. Your bandit knife does actually cause bleed at a regularly frequent basis. But that's usually because of its fast swing speed and its low damage. And, you know, is it really worth trading big damage and way better weapons just for the ability to bleed enemies? No, it's not. That's a stupid trade-off. And, just to add the insulting icing on the cake, many enemies just don't bleed in this game. They just straight up don't. Obviously you've got things like skeletons, but you've got even more than that, the clams in the Crystal Cave, you've got golems, you've got stone guardians, you've got, I mean, there's a decent amount of enemies that just don't bleed in the first place, much less the fact that the weapons themselves don't even cause bleed quickly enough to make it worth using. If it maybe like, if bleed maybe scaled with resistance or something like that, we'd have a relatively decent time here, but as of right now, bleed is the only thing in Dark Souls 1 that I pretty much consider useless. The bandit knife is only useful at max level to get crit hits with. And the bandit knife, you know, like I said, actually can cause bleed pretty quickly, relatively easily, but it's not worth the huge trade-off in damage that you are sacrificing just to use it. 2 out of 10 bleed build. Just, literally the bandit knife is the only thing saving it. And again, even many bosses don't bleed, so what's the freaking point? Speaking of 2, now Dark Souls 2 immediately has an advantage over Dark Souls 1 because many weapons can have a bleed stone applied to them. So automatically, finding a weapon to cause bleed is not an issue. And then when you start attacking enemies, proccing bleed is actually not that hard, and many enemies do still bleed. So, okay then, a huge step up from Dark Souls 1. In fact, bandit knife returns. You can now power stance bandit knives with a sick looking moveset, and I found the drip that is perfect for a dual bandit knife set. Look at this drip. Look at it. Tell me this ain't drip. So if you can cause bleed pretty easily, many enemies can bleed, and you can turn many weapons into bleed weapons, what's the downside? Because we know there is one, otherwise Elden Ring would not be known as the primary build for bleeding. Well, the problem is that when you start doing bleed damage, you may not even notice you're causing bleed because the damage of the bleed proc is super low. Like, we are talking, I didn't even notice I was causing bleed for the first few, like, attempts at trying to do it. I was one-handing a Chandler's Trident because it can do, like, a really quick 6-hit with a one-handed strong attack, and I didn't even realize I was causing bleed on enemies. That's how low the damage is. And the trade-off? Not really worth it. But in Dark Souls 2, to Dark Souls 2's credit, anything is really viable. I mean, heck, you can even play the game with a broken straight sword and it won't be that much harder than a normal playthrough. So because everything in Dark Souls 2 is viable anyways, there's no harm in putting bleed on it. And heck, you can do like I did and amp up the bleed with a dual bandit knife setup, power stance. Very fun. Very fun. Lots of weapons can do it, and you can just kind of do whatever you want. Dark Souls 2 has a huge step over all the other Souls games in the department of build variety. So, lots of weapons that can bleed. None of the weapons are particularly terrible anyways. Bleed proc is easy to hit. The only problem is that the bleed proc itself doesn't do much damage. And that's really the only negative, which means there's no real reason to do it, because there's weapons out there that do more damage than that's worth the scaling that you're losing by applying bleed to a weapon. But it's also Dark Souls 2, and, you know, no real reason not to. You can still get away with it, and you're not actually going to lose that much. However, it is never the optimal build, so because of that, it's useful in some cases, but I think I'm going to have to hit it with a 6.5 out of 10. Good, just not really useful in that regard. Moving on to Dark Souls 3. So, with the massive improvement that Dark Souls 2 made over Dark Souls 1, you'd expect 3 to follow suit. And in some cases, Dark Souls 3 did improve on the bleed build. The damage is higher, thank God. Proccing is a little more difficult than Dark Souls 2, but not as bad as Dark Souls 1, so there's that. And you can once again apply bleed to most weapons in the game. So, where do the drawbacks lie? So this is specifically a Dark Souls 3 issue. Weapons in Dark Souls 3 just don't feel very good. There is no real overpowered stuff in Dark Souls 3, and build variety is notoriously bad in that game. And because of that, a lot of the melee weapons in the game are fine, barely acceptable a lot of the time. They're just standard weapons. Even things as powerful as the Sellsword Twin Blades don't quite delete things in the same way that some weapons in Dark Souls 1 and 2 do. So with that in mind, so you have weapons that are kind of already mid as far as Dark Souls standards to start with, and now let's apply bleed to the weapon and lower its stat scaling. Ooh, I think you might know where I'm going with there. The loss in damage from lacking scaling is huge. You will never want to do it unless you know the weapon will cause bleed very quickly. And there's only really a few of those that even do that. There's really not a reason to put bleed on anything else except for things like those talon, the crow talons, really fun, really cool, or other claw types that can attack really quickly in quick succession. Anything that attacks in quick succession, put bleed on that and you should be alright. But even then, after testing some of the better weapons with the higher bleed values, because you can't attack frequently enough, they didn't actually mean much. So I ended up just going back to the crow talons, which are really fun to be fair. Very fun moveset. All the sort of talon, claw movesets are very fun. I love them. But they're kind of only good because they cause bleed fast. So when you run into an enemy that can't bleed, you're gonna struggle, especially if it actually has any kind of poise, because, well, we all know you don't. So while you can put bleed on a lot of weapons, there really aren't that many useful ones. It's like a perfect cross between Dark Souls 2 and 1 where, sure, you do have a lot of weapon options, but they're not really good, and you're going to really notice the loss in damage in Dark Souls 3 because nothing in Dark Souls 3 is particularly powerful. Because of that, it's only got a few options. I'd say a 4 or 5 out of 10, to be honest. It exists, but there's not really any sort of advantage you have to using it. And because upgrading weapons in Dark Souls 3 is also relatively annoying as a process, I'm going to stick with 4 out of 10 because it's just not really fun to go through and do all that for a build that, at the end of the day, kinda sucks. But hey, the Bandit Knife is still pretty decent at causing bleed in Dark Souls 3. The Bandit Knife is the great equalizer for Dark Souls. The Bandit Knife is just good. I don't know why. Don't ask me why. The Bandit Knife in these games are just really good at what they do. They don't do much damage, but what they do is still pretty good. Bleed and crit damage. I mean, why not? Let's go with it, right? So with that in mind, I think we have our clear winners. Ranking from the worst bleed builds to the best. Number 3 is Dark Souls 1. It just doesn't have any weapons that cause bleed, and there's nothing that even takes bleed that doesn't die fast enough for bleed to even not be procced. It's ludicrous. Bleed could not exist in Dark Souls 1 and nothing would change in the slightest. The only weapon is the Bandit Knife. In second place is Dark Souls 3. As much as the damage increased and enough enemies can bleed, there just isn't enough weapon options that do decent enough damage to ever make bleed really worth using, unless you want to use the Claw or Talon moveset, which again, is very fun, but it's really not worth it at the end of the day, especially for a normal playthrough. And the king of Dark Souls bleed builds is Dark Souls 2, mainly because anything in Dark Souls 2 works. You're never really at a huge disadvantage trying something that is quote-unquote underpowered, and Dark Souls 2 is often regarded as having the second best build variety in the Souls saga, including Elden Ring, and there is a reason for that. So those are the bleed builds of the Dark Souls games. Go ahead and test these out for yourself. I could have missed some really powerful weapons in Dark Souls 3, heck, maybe even Dark Souls 1. I could have very well missed something. So go and check it out yourself, leave your findings in the comments, and subscribe for more Souls and Elden Ring content. And remember, don't you dare go hollow.